Okay, so we are all here. Let's just take this forward. So, on behalf of Observer Research Foundation, let me welcome you all again to this discussion this evening, this morning in the U.S. And as we know, that last month, the U.S. State Department's Office of Policy Planning released a major report titled "The Elements of the China Challenge," which aims at providing a kind of a blueprint for America's response to China's rise. And this paper, which some have compared to the very influential George Kennan's telegram of 1946, an article of 1947, is likely to set the tone of American foreign policy discourse for the coming years. And we are privileged to have today with us Peter Berkowitz, Director of Policy Planning at the US State Department, to talk about the paper, its background, its key arguments, as well as its likely impact. And to discuss the global ramifications and ramifications for India, we also have a very distinguished set of panelists with us, Dr. C. Mohan, Institute of South Asian Studies, Singapore, Indrani Bagchi, Diplomatic Editor, Times of India, and Paul Kapoor, Member Policy Planning, US State Department. So without further ado, Peter, it's back to you for your presentation first, and then I'll go to the three discussants. Before we go to our viewers, who let me remind them, can send their questions, comments, and observations at the using the Q&A box on their screens. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the Observer Research Foundation for putting together this conversation, to which we very much look forward. The policy planning staff paper, The Elements of the China Challenge, really has its origins in three factors or events from the summer and late fall of 2019. First, as I became director of the policy planning staff, I took note of Secretary Mike Pompeo's general reorientation of the work of the United States State Department around the China challenge. Second, I undertook a kind of obligatory rereading of George Kennan's two most famous writings, the Long Telegram from Moscow in 1946, and The Sources of Soviet Conduct, which appeared in Foreign Affairs in 1947. And upon rereading those two writings, I was struck by a few aspects of them. First, Kennan's insistence that to understand what he referred to as the personality of Soviet power, it would be necessary to understand ideology and circumstances and the interplay between the two of them. Second, Kennan stressed in both the Long Telegram and the Sources of Soviet Conduct not that Soviet conduct derived from not one but two sets of ideas, Marxism-Leninism and also traditional Russian nationalism. And third, Kennan stressed in both writings that in order for the United States to prevail in this long struggle for freedom, it would only be necessary for the United States to measure up to what was best in the American tradition, by which I believe he meant a commitment to America's founding principles and constitutional traditions. A third factor in the formation of what is very much a team effort, the policy planning paper, was general request that we sent out in the policy planning staff to all members in late fall 2019 as we were gearing up for this project. And the request was very simple. Please discuss China's conduct, Chinese inroads in your region of the world or in your functional area. So Indo-Pacific, Africa, Middle East, Europe, Western Hemisphere, but also if you're a student of, let's say, international organizations, please discuss China's conduct there. We received 3 to 5 page memos from each member of the policy planning staff, and we discovered that while no particular member was fully aware of what was going on in the other regions, each member had much to say about China's conduct, China's inroads in his or her area. This set the foundations for what became the elements of the China Challenge. Now, it's easy to state the China Challenge, at least as we understand it. China is a great power. Great powers tend to seek preeminence. But China seeks, in our view, a special kind of preeminence. China seeks not merely preeminence within the established order, but to transform the international order, starting with the greater Indo-Pacific, and reconfigure that order to make it more friendly to China's authoritarian interests and authoritarian goals. That's the China challenge in a nutshell. Now, however, in so stating the China challenge, the policy planning paper, and I must emphasize we build on a number of documents previously produced by the Trump administration. In so stating, the Trump administration and the policy planning staff paper break with the conventional wisdom, and here I emphasize, in the United States. The United States was not alone in subscribing to the conventional wisdom, but we did subscribe to it. What has been the conventional wisdom in the United States for more than a few decades? The conventional wisdom has been that ever since the opening of China's economy in the late 1970s, the introduction of capitalist, of free market elements, the view has been in the United States that increasing economic liberalization would bring about political liberalization. And the United States could encourage this trajectory by engaging with China and welcoming China into the established international order, making a place for international organizations. The consequence would be that sooner or later, and sooner rather than later, China would become, to use the technical term, a responsible stakeholder in the international order. It has been clear from some time that that opinion has proven mistaken. China has actually, since putting down the Tiananmen Square demonstrations of 1989, China has redoubled on its authoritarian ways, both at home and abroad. And the purpose of the policy planning staff paper, consistent with the mission of the policy planning staff in the U.S. State Department, is to take a step back, take a broader view, see the problem whole, not lay down concrete policy, but sketch a framework within which foreign policy can be devised and implemented. That's what we sought to do in the elements of the China challenge. Now, we argue in the paper that China is a challenge in the first place because of its conduct. What is China's conduct? Well, first, there's dictatorship at home. Consistent with 20th century Marxist-Leninist dogma, the Chinese Communist Party maintains one-party repressive rule in China. The party controls the economy and society, culture, religion, information, through the creation of a massive surveillance state. It censors, it disseminates disinformation, it inculcates now Xi Jinping thought. Moreover, the Chinese Communist Party engages in the repression of religious and ethnic minorities. As you all know, more than 1 million Uyghurs have been detained in re-education camps. Tibetans remain subjugated. Ethnic Mongolians in the northeastern part of China are subject to increasingly tight controls. Some 70 million Christians in China are unable to practice their religion as they understand it. That's dictatorship at home. Abroad, we see schemes of economic coercion and co-optation in all regions of the world. And these schemes of coercion and co-optation follow a common pattern. First, there's China's practice of intellectual property theft. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year. This intellectual property theft is probably the greatest act of theft in human history. China's efforts, deliberate efforts to commandeer supply chains, which have especially come into focus as a result of the worldwide pandemic. China's efforts to achieve domination in key high-tech industries and other industries such as shipbuilding. China's efforts to become the 5G provider of choice around the world, which of course will provide a pipeline of massive amounts of data to the Chinese Communist Party. There is the China's Built Bridge and Road Initiative, which seeks not merely to build infrastructure around the world, which is a good, but to create dependence upon in nation states around the world on the Chinese Communist Party by providing what appear to be very attractive financial deals, but very quickly lead to debt traps for the countries, and in many cases have produced corruption among the local elites. And not least, there is China's efforts to use the freedom and openness of liberal democracies against them. We see this with the Confucius Institutes on American campuses, in which campuses are provided what once again appear to be very favorable financial terms for organizations that will teach Mandarin and Chinese culture. That's desirable, but in exchange, the Chinese Communist Party extracts concessions from university campuses to not criticize China. In other words, a blow to freedom of speech on campuses in the United States. In addition, there are China's efforts to rewire international organizations from within, to infuse them with Chinese, or I should say Chinese Communist Party standards and norms. And not least, and a point of which I'm sure you're acutely aware, is China's determination to build a, quote, a world-class military that rivals and perhaps surpasses that of the United States. If you add all of this up, you see that China is actually credibly pursuing a quest, not merely for preeminence within the established order, but to transform that order. Now, why do we emphasize transform the order? For two reasons. One, we see it in the pattern of conduct. But second, attention to the ideas that the Chinese Communist Party repeatedly, consistently, emphatically proclaims, reveals the deeper pattern within this conduct. Throughout, I should be careful here to distinguish between the Chinese Communist Party that rules the People's Republic China in a manner that is authoritarian, collectivist, and imperial, and the Chinese people. But the Chinese Communist Party is worth focusing on here, again, because they have the power in the country. We argue in the paper that the authoritarianism, the collectivism, and the imperialism of the CCP derive from two streams of thought. Again, traditional Marxism-Leninism, but in this case, an extreme, an extreme interpretation of Chinese nationalism. The Marxism-Leninism helps explain the repressive one-party rule at home, its strategies, its techniques. But of course, communism is not enough to explain Chinese conduct. There's nothing in Marxism and Leninism that proclaims that Hong Kong is and always has been and must always remain a part of China. There is nothing in Marxism and Leninism that requires the Chinese Communist Party to promulgate a chauvinistic view of the superiority of Chinese culture and Chinese institutions throughout China, and to demand acquiescence from China's minorities. There's nothing in Marxism-Leninism that proclaims that Taiwan always has been and must always remain a part of China, and nothing within Marxism-Leninism that grants enormous swaths of the South and East China Sea well beyond recognized international boundaries to China. All of this is better explained in terms of Chinese nationalism. Now, we understand that often communism and nationalism are thought to be contrary ways of thinking about politics. We believe that the Chinese Communist Party reconciles these two schools of thought by affirming an international order, but an international order that is inspired by China's understanding of socialism, but it will be an international order with Beijing at the center, reflecting what Xi Jinping refers to as the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. A crucial point here, the paper does not argue for some kind of historical determinism. determinacy. It does not argue that China's conduct is locked in by its geopolitical circumstances or by its traditions. In fact, we point out that a kind of experiment has been run in the region. Peoples no less steeped in traditional Confucian culture than the people of China. We're thinking of the people of Hong Kong, the people of Taiwan, the people of South Korea have chosen freedom and democracy. So what we're speaking about is a set of ideas adopted, promulgated by the Chinese Communist Party that we believe inform Chinese conduct, help us understand Chinese conduct. Now, we also do not believe that somehow the People's Republic of China is an invulnerable giant. We see a number of vulnerabilities in China. One set of vulnerabilities derived from the very nature of authoritarian regimes. Down through history, generally and for the most part, history teaches us that authoritarian regimes have difficulty over the long run maintaining a culture of innovation, a thriving economy, and adapting with changing circumstances for the simple reason that they are devoted to suppressing dissent. Second, study of authoritarian regimes throughout history teaches us that authoritarian regimes have difficulty maintaining friends and alliances because they tend to be untrustworthy and vicious. And third, authoritarian regimes tend to expend considerable sums in repression at home. In addition to these weaknesses or vulnerabilities, China suffers from vulnerabilities that are specific to its circumstances. A variety of forms of economic instability, beginning with roughly 600 million Chinese still living on $140 a day. In addition, there's demographic instability arising from the one-child policy. There is the degradation of the environment. China is the #1 polluter in the world. There's the cost of China's specific massive surveillance state. There are questions about succession in China, Xi's succession. And not least, there's the damage to China's reputation. In our judgment, the justified damage to China's reputation in the world as a result of first its cover-up of the virus born in Wuhan, and then a concerted disinformation campaign about its role in permitting the global pandemic to spread. A recent Pew Forum poll shows China's ratings and public opinion to have suffered a steep decline over the last few years, and we believe this is a result of publics around the world becoming more aware of China's authoritarian ways. In the conclusion of our paper, we do two things. First, notwithstanding my references to George Kennan early on, we distinguish the China challenge from the Soviet challenge. We note the similarity. Soviet Union was authoritarian, communist authoritarian government that sought to remake the world order and place Moscow at the center. The Chinese Communist Party maintains one-party repressive rule. It too, in our judgment, seeks to remake the world order, placing this time Beijing at the center. Both represented the great threat to freedom of their age. However, there is a profound difference. The Soviet Union maintained power, sought to spread power, transform the order primarily by dint of its military strength. In the first place, it controlled half of Europe through military force. It sought to export revolution, prop up Marxist states, Marxist governments, or install Marxist regimes. The Chinese Communist Party operates in a very different fashion, although it has developed a formidable military. The Chinese Communist Party is primarily waging a struggle for the shape of international order in the economic realm. This creates a difficulty for all of the world's major economies, and many others. And the difficulty is this: all of our economies, most definitely including that of the United States, are entangled, indeed deeply entangled, with that of China. So the perplexity is this: we must find a way to continue to cooperate with China while recognizing that the CCP rule of China seems to be inseparable from gross human rights abuses and defiance of the of international law. How do we bring that about? At the end of the paper, we identified 10 tasks that the United States must undertake to secure freedom. By securing freedom, we mean both, as our first point emphasizes, ensuring that freedom prospers in the United States, ensuring that we honor our constitutional traditions. We have a prosperous economy that includes everybody, and we have a vibrant civil society, which families, communities prosper. We recognize we have work to do. We must maintain a strong military. We must reaffirm our dedication to a free and open international order. We must turn to our alliance system and international institutions, not to turn our backs on them, but to make sure that both our alliances and international organizations are well structured in order to defend freedom in our age. We must look to cooperate where possible with China, based, however, on norms of fairness and reciprocity, norms that we believe are deeply embedded within the established international order. And we believe that just as Kennan argued in the late 1940s and 1950s, in order to prevail, the United States must especially look to its own educational system. We have a long way to go in educating American citizens about the scope of the China challenge. We have a long way to go in reforming our educational system so that it teaches students well about the principles of the American founding and the constitutional tradition. We in the United States have a long way to go, as the U.S. State Department sought to do in the 1950s, to stand up a new generation of diplomats and public policy thinkers who know Mandarin and are well grounded in Chinese culture, not only Chinese language, but Chinese culture and history. Indeed, the China challenge, which some people have understood to mean that the United States must turn its back on the world, means that the United States actually must turn itself to the world even more energetically, because the China challenge, as I've suggested, is playing itself out around the world. So we must learn better not only Mandarin, Chinese culture and history, but also the languages, cultures, and histories of other strategic rivals, but also friends, allies, and partners, the better to make common cause with them in defense of freedom. And finally, the United States must remain what has long been a champion of freedom, which can mean many things. By champion of freedom, what we mean is at home and on the international stage, champion the principles of freedom, standing with those who stand for freedom. I will stop there. I very much look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Peter. That was a great survey. I think you've given us a good background of where I think this paper started, and the consequences of the challenges you have mapped out for America, and also I think for the world to which we'll now turn. Two things I think stand out very interestingly. In a sense, this idea of what are the intellectual sources of Chinese conduct? What is driving Chinese behavior? And for a long time, we have not seen the kind of focus on the Chinese Communist Party and how Chinese Communist Party's worldview shapes its behavior. I think that's where you have rightly focused in this paper, and very interesting conversation one can have around this. The other, I think, is the vulnerabilities that China is facing. We all talk about China's rise, and I think here there are enough vulnerabilities that one needs to be cognizant of, and I think their implications for the global order are equally significant, as are Chinese strengths. And finally, I think the final point that you ended up with about education, this is so important not only in the American context but also in the context of countries like India. where we are struggling to cope with the rise of China, and we also are facing a great paucity of scholarship on what is going on in and around our vicinity. So I think all these questions perhaps will be reflected in some of the conversations that we'll have now. Let me invite Dr. Raja Mohan now for his first set of comments on your presentation, on the paper itself, and larger, I think, the issues that this paper raises. Raja, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Harsh. Delighted to be part of this panel. I think we've had a wonderful summary of the paper that State Department has done under the leadership of Dr. Berkowitz. Let me offer in true Chinese tradition, I mean, one comment and two questions. There was a famous Deng Xiaoping maxim of 1 center, 2 points back at the turn of the 1990s. Essentially, the way Chinese present their core ideas to the larger party membership and the public. So on the comment, let me say a few words about the context in which this report is coming out. Dr. Berkowitz talked about the Kennan paper, the differences and similarities between Communist Party of Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party. He rightly points to the fact that it is really China's deep economic integration into the international system. It's virtually the second largest economy, deeply connected to all the other major economies. So dealing with the Chinese challenge obviously is going to be a lot more complicated and far more demanding than dealing with the Soviet Union, which deliberately and consciously separated itself in the name of building an alternative system to capitalism. That's one set of issues. But equally important, I think, for us, those of us who are outside the US, to see the changed context in Washington. I think that how the US implements some of the ideas that have come up here in the State Department paper, a lot would depend on the United States itself. Compared to back to the Second World War, there was, you can say, it was not, easily, there were fractures, there were differences, but there was, I think, far greater unity in Washington in terms of how to deal with the post-war world. There was a core establishment whose conclusions were largely acceptable to the rest of the other elements of the political and economic class. But today the US is deeply polarized and many basic assumptions that we all taken for granted about American history, its political organization are being challenged from within. And I think this is a very, very different US. And one hopes that the US can get its own sense of getting its act together and without that, I think partly some of the proposals of the paper really talk about that rebuilding a consensus on China. But I think my sense is that it looks pretty hard at this point to do that, at least in the near term. To Trump administration's credit, I think it's really called out the China challenge, which very few in the US system were willing to do. And I think that itself is a major contribution of the administration as it goes out in the next few weeks. This paper, along with speeches by Secretary Pompeo and other senior officials in the last few months, will definitely go down, in my view, as important markers in the way the international debate on China has changed in the last few months. Whether we agree with this paper or not, I mean, there is no question that it has staked out a very coherent identification of the challenge ahead and the elements of a strategy that the US and the rest of the world needs in dealing with the China challenge. This is no mean achievement, given the previous deep elite consensus within the United States on China, and unsurprisingly, the Trump administration's China policy has been a controversial one within the system, and one would love to hear from Dr. Berkowitz. I mean, I don't want to put him on a spot on this one, but how the Biden-China policy might play out that in the coming days, and whether the ideas he's laid out in this paper would really help build a consensus on how to deal with China. I think one issue right at the beginning, I would say, this idea of cooperation and competition, which Dr. Berkowitz talked about, is also something when you hear from the Biden folks saying that, look, we need to cooperate where necessary and compete with them where we must. This idea is a good one, because given the Chinese size, there's no way anyone can avoid engagement with China. But the fact is, the devil, as always, is in the detail, and finding the right balance between the two imperatives is the real challenge. And I think any oscillation or any sense of the U.S. variation on this issue of competition and cooperation would create immense harm, certainly in Asia, for all the others in Asia who are on China's periphery, who are watching very carefully to see where exactly is the U.S. headed in dealing with China. Any sense of vacillation in the U.S., that just when we saw the Trump administration was laying out a clear set of affirmations on how to deal with China, if there is seen as to be a big shift from this policy in the next administration, then how the rest of the region here reacts is going to be quite something, because the uncertainty in the U.S. approach is quite a challenge for many of us in the region who staked out positions on China, and a U.S. that is seen as changing will have huge costs to bear in the later years. Because even more important, the margin of error for the U.S. has shrunk significantly, and I think it's very important that any errors this time, unlike in the period when U.S. hegemony was absolute and far more assured, that today mistakes made will have huge costs in Asia and on China's periphery in particular. So my two questions, let me come to the first one, is the question of sovereignty. That if you see the third conclusion and the third point in the executive summary, where the paper talks about building a free and open rules-based international order, which is composed of sovereign nation states and based on the respect for human rights and the fidelity of the rule of law. But there is a fundamental tension here that is it about sovereignty? Because normally we rarely heard about the American establishment on sovereignty, but one of the big changes in the Trump's worldview has been this emphasis on sovereignty, which has been very, very unique. And I think it has a strong resonance in Asia, where it is valued national sovereignty, only recently won from European colonial powers. But I hope Dr. Berkowitz can expand on this, because the emphasis on sovereignty actually gives the US a chance to work with those forces in Asia which have a stake in resisting Chinese hegemony, because the US cannot defend what China's neighbors don't want to defend or can't defend. So therefore, a strategy that works with regional nationalisms can stand up against Chinese nationalism, which seeks hegemony over rest of Asia. But then they talk about democracy, they talk about human rights, at the same breath, of course, produces a contradiction, because the moment you talk about those, how far do you go in promoting that? I mean, I think we've seen the Trump administration, contrary to the criticism that it does not support human rights, are actually taken up a fairly solid positions on what's happening in China. But then the question comes that if the next administration says, look, we need to deal with China, therefore engaging China on climate change is far more important than human rights, then you have one set of outcomes. But on the other hand, the US is trying to mobilize Asian support to deal with Chinese hegemony, but yet is willing to pick quarrels on the Rohingya issue in Myanmar, on the Thai protests in Thailand, and on the nature of various issues that come up across the board. I mean, the entire Asian landmass, that is it going to, how are you going to construct a coalition if we're going to pick quarrels with everyone? And I think at least in the Cold War, there was a clarity in terms of the primacy was about defeating the Soviet threat, and others' goals were, at least in many cases, were subsumed to the larger challenge of dealing with China. But in the present circumstance, are we going to see a strategy, I mean, that would actually try and will fall between multiple options? That is, if containing China is main option, but at the same time, you also want to talk about democracy promotion, would the US end up actually not being able to do any of these effectively and falling between multiple stools that could actually happen? So therefore, how do you square this difficulty of actually focusing on the China threat and mobilizing a coalition that can actually deal with that problem? Related to the sovereignty question is the whole argument on globalization that the Trump administration raised, which is really the issue of, do countries cede their right how to distribute the benefits of growth and within the society to international capital, to a global order, or those are choices that had to be made sovereign by nations within the society? And I think that challenge is real, whether it's on climate change or other issues. And there, I think Trump administration had made it very clear that the US must decide the issues on the basis of its own social demands and concerns. Now, would the US cede that to the other societies, and how that plays out? The question of economic sovereignty is the question. And here, I think you might end up with a paradox, which is US talks about sovereignty, but actually ends up with an interventionist posture, while the Chinese talk about non-intervention, but are actually today developed tools for intervention, which are fairly substantive, which are unbelievably sophisticated today, using various new techniques. So I think this problem of how to deal with the question of sovereignty in the face of Chinese challenges is an important one. The second question I had was on burden sharing. In the point 5 of the paper, talks about the importance of alliances and coalitions, and I think here it's my sense is that Trump has borne a lot of criticism for apparently undermining US alliances. But Trump has raised a valid question: can the US taxpayers forever bear the burden of defending Europe and Asia? Would Asians do more in sharing this burden? So I think for countries like India, at least, I think we should be more prepared for share the burden, rather than merely expecting the Americans to do the heavy lifting and then be criticized for doing so. So the question then is, if the US is willing to share the burden, is it also willing to share the leadership? So any distribution of responsibilities and the burdens of dealing with the China challenge must also involve some sharing of leadership, greater consultation than the US has traditionally been known to. So therefore the question is that kind of an approach part of American tradition, or is it simply, I'll do it my way, or I'm going to get out of the way? So I think that choice becomes harder, becomes far more important at this point in our region. So Harsh, I don't know if I've overshot my limit. I think I'll stop here. But let me congratulate once again Dr. Berkowitz for a wonderful paper that clarifies so many things.
Thank you, Raja. That was great. I think one point which Raja is raising, perhaps, and which transcend a lot of the issues that he has raised, is about priority. If the China challenge is what it is, then how does America prioritize its multiple foreign policy, multiple foreign policy challenges, and how does it work out? How does it work with other like-minded countries to make sure that happens? Let me go to Indrani now for the second set of comments. Indrani, yours are yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Harsh. Thank you, Dr. Berkowitz, for that, for a great paper. And it was, as Raj, who generally says everything in advance. No, it's a great paper because at least what we have witnessed in the past few years is a China that is a much more of a determined power, and it's willing to use all the tools at its disposal to transform itself and the world around it in its own image, or as you put it, to make it more friendly. My question, there are two things. That one is Raj spoke about what it is that about what it is that the US can do in terms of sovereignty, and I just wanted to take that forward, because there are countries who are with much more limited resources than, say, us, who are doing their bit to stand up to China, but they can't if they, like Myanmar, if they're coming under the kind of sanctions that you put them under, or the entire Western world puts them under. So there have to be, in a way, if your alliances are your alliances, in some way, that middle path with alliances, I think the US would need to work on a lot more. The other part which I find that is not that's missing in a way is the whole area of multilateral cooperation. I mean, I was looking at the fact that the UN Human Rights Council gave China a complete pass last week on the Uyghur problem, the Uyghur detentions, and so a part of it is, while of course the UNHRC is populated by countries whose commitment to human rights is fairly dodgy, but a part of it is also the fact that the US has also walked away from a lot of multilateral organizations, leaving it open. There are two things. One, there is no alternative. Two, whatever there is now being controlled more and more by China. So you do see China taking a bigger and bigger slice of both funding and influence in a lot of UN bodies, the UN Security Council. So my question to you would be, is there maybe a rethink on what elements of multilateralism can be used to push back or stand up against this particular challenge? I think China would be perfectly within its rights to say, oh well, the Human Rights Council, which everybody agrees with and everybody is a part of, has nothing to say on the Uyghur detentions. I think there must be a certain way in which countries like the US should consider going back to the multilateral world, to the multilateral system that exists at the moment. Either we destroy the entire thing, put it all back together again in a new form, which puts, of course, I mean, India has a long grouse, which every Indian diplomat, I think, would have aired it, that we are not part of the UN Security Council, and that's a different matter. That's related and but separate. But what it is that in a way, the world is also waiting for a US voice to be at the helm of the global multilateral system as we see today. One of the ways that China has managed to do very well in what you spoke about, which is using the economic, being able to change the economic order, is also by using the WTO in ways that has remade the world, literally remade the world economic order in a way that we cannot challenge them anymore. So the question again that I would ask is, we would like to see the US coming back into the multilateral system, and for that I think there must be a greater, while there should be a greater burden sharing in terms of other countries stepping up. I mean, the US bears the brunt of all the funding for all these agencies. But yes, that burden sharing should be introduced. But I think the US as the premier influential voice really ought to consider coming back into the multilateral system. Where countries like India are concerned, we look at something Raj has already spoken about it, but we also look at the kind of decoupling that is going on. India is doing its own little bit of decoupling, not very successfully, I may add. If you look at the fact that India has, has exported more, something very small, which is exported more iron ore to China in 2019 and 2020 than than sold to its own domestic companies. And then you get a sense of how difficult it is to extricate the political elements of standing up against the China challenge with the economic elements of the market that China has weaponized, literally, for the rest of the world, specifically for the US. I mean, US has imported more from China in 2020 than ever before. So it's not. I'm just curious to see how you think the coming administration will be able to walk this path on these two counts. When we all recognize the elements of the China challenge, we feel it being right next door to China in different ways. You feel it in different ways, but we all come to the same conclusion that China must be stopped. The question is, as you move into a different administration, what is your sense of how these areas might be dealt with or addressed by both your administration right now and another administration come next month? I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Indrani. I think, Peter, a lot of questions there about the transition and what would happen post-transition to the new administration. I'm sure you'd want to reflect on that. But before that, let me bring Paul to the conversation. And Paul, the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you, Harsh. As you noted earlier, I work with Dr. Berkowitz as a member of the policy planning staff, so I think I won't ask him questions during my time here, but rather maybe expand a bit on some of the implications of the paper and focus really on what this take on China means for how the United States thinks about India and US-India relations. I think analytically, one can describe the China paper as part of a kind of two-step process. The first is identifying the problem, and then the second is finding solutions to it. And the China Challenge paper, it talks about solutions, but it's really a focus on identifying the problem, getting square on that, and the threats to our interests in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond, resulting from Chinese behavior, the danger that rather than having a free, open, and inclusive region characterized by rule of law, free access to commons, unfettered commerce, deliberative dispute resolution, and so on, we have a region that's dominated by a single authoritarian power, favoring fait accomplis, access control, debt trap diplomacy, coercive dispute resolution, and so on. And then the next step is sort of to say, well, what do we do about it? We don't have a paper on this, but I think it's fair to say that India figures prominently in the solution piece of this puzzle. And the reason for India's prominent role is that the solution to the China problem, and this was alluded to in a number of the comments over the past few minutes, the solution to the problem is going to require us to focus on alliances and partnerships. And the reason for that is that none of the countries facing the China challenge, not the United States, not India, not any of the other regional countries, can meet the challenge alone. We don't have the wherewithal for that, and we're going to have to work together. Forming a coalition of like-minded states or coalitions to share the burden of preventing the region from being dominated by a single authoritarian power and ensuring that the region remains free and open. So what does that mean for the United States and India? I think the short answer is that it highlights the importance of continuing to move forward with what we've been doing, namely promoting growing U.S.-India strategic cooperation. And getting a little bit more specific, I think we can identify 3 layers at which, or levels at which, this is going to happen. The first is the bilateral relationship. Together, the United States and India can help to create the foundation for a coalition of like-minded states to resist coercion and ensure that the Indo-Pacific region remains free and open. Now, this kind of partnership would be more flexible, I think, than a traditional treaty alliance, ensuring that both sides are able to retain their strategic autonomy. And importantly, it would not require that the partners agree on everything. As long as we're able to prevent that hegemonic domination of the region, we will have achieved our strategic goal. And we do that by working together to build capacity, to build Indian capacity, to help India stand as an independent power, provide security in its neighborhood. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But this, by definition, will prevent hegemonic domination of the region by China and achieve our strategic goal of freedom and openness, even if, again, we don't see eye to eye on every single issue that faces us. Second, I think India and the United States can work together as part of minilateral entities like the Quad to promote shared norms, enhance stability and security throughout the Indo-Pacific. And this level of approach has the advantage of breadth, essentially providing 4 anchor points to facilitate our preferred governing principles and also security cooperation. The Quad does have a relatively short track record. It's seen some ups and downs in terms of willingness to commit to it, but it's now moving forward with the recent ministerial meeting. And after that, we saw the U.S., India, Japan, Australia naval exercises that followed on, and I think this is going to be another important locus of U.S.-India cooperation. Finally, Indo-U.S. cooperation can help India serve as a regional leader in a multilateral environment. And Raja was just raising this question, is the United States willing to see other countries take leadership roles? I think the answer to that is yes. And in this case, India can use that enhanced capacity that we've built together to play a leadership role in South and Southeast Asia, leveraging your unique advantages, close proximity to other countries, civilizational and historical ties to them. We saw this happen as India took the lead in organizing multilateral distribution of COVID relief earlier this year. In the military sphere, India's joint operations and exercises with other countries in the region, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam. These make an important contribution to regional security and help build those coalitions of like-minded states and contribute to burden sharing with strategic partners like the United States, which was rightly pointed out, can't be everywhere and do everything all the time. And this is something that I think the United States will want India to do more of. So identifying the nature of the China challenge, as this paper does, will lead us to devise solutions that focus on cooperation and partnership in a multi-layered fashion. Each of these layers differs in terms of breadth, but the layers have common themes. Each layer focuses on cooperation, on burden sharing, and the recognition that we can't meet the China challenge alone. Cooperation at each level is flexible, recognizes that partners may be more diverse and require more autonomy than members of legacy alliance structures, even as they're united by the overriding goal of maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific region. And perhaps most importantly, each layer focuses on that core of U.S.-India strategic cooperation, which can serve as a foundation for this broad strategic project. And I expect would continue even with the new administration. I know a number of people raised that question, both Indrani and Raja. Peter will speak to it, I'm sure. But my expectation would be these are enduring principles, enduring interests, and we've seen them carry India-U.S. cooperation on an upward trajectory through multiple administrations, both Democrat and Republican. So I know we have limited time, and I don't want to impinge too much on our open discussion, so I'll stop there. But it's kind of a quick snapshot of what I would see as the implications of the China challenge for Indo-US relations.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for bringing the India question squarely into the conversation. Let me go quickly to Peter for the first set of questions, which both Raja and Indrani have asked. And I think it would be interesting to just focus on, I think, two aspects. One is the trade and technology dimension and how difficult or easy it might be to decouple or not to decouple with China, given the challenges that we are facing already. And the other is, which I think is on a lot of people's minds, is this domestic transition in America. The fact that Mr. Biden may have won, but Trumpism survives, that polarization, how will that affect or not affect the China challenge and America's ability to shape Chinese behavior going forward? So with that, Peter, the first round of questions, I think we can choose whatever you want to address.
Well, thank you very much. Before I address questions, it's incumbent upon me to say thank you for the excellent questions and observations. And also to say that the policy planning staff is very fortunate to have somebody as knowledgeable about both the United States and India as Paul Kapoor. So very quickly on the technology question you mentioned, of course I can't elaborate concrete policies here, but I think what our aim has to be is for, I borrowed this phrase, targeted decoupling. Targeted decoupling. Radical decoupling is impossible. As we've already discussed, China's economy is well integrated into the world economy. All of our economies are deeply entangled with Chinese economy. What we need to do is find ways to insist that the cooperation, the inevitable and in some sense desirable cooperation with China, is based upon those norms of fairness and reciprocity that are built into the established international order. How do we do that? That's the work of, that's the practical work of diplomacy, but that's the goal. As far as the incoming administration goes, my colleague Paul Kapoor has already alluded to this. It seems to me that both the United States and India recognize a community of interests in the Indo-Pacific, two Indo-Pacific nations. We both wish to resist Chinese aggression. We both wish to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific and larger international order. I am hopeful that that community of interests will promote continuity in America's China policy. Differences there will be. I quite agree that the perception, the reality of vacillation on the part of the United States will be harmful to the interests of the United States and will be injurious to our partners. I hope we can avoid vacillation. I do quickly run through, try to address a few other of the hardest of questions. I'm saved by the bell. I only have a few seconds for each. On the question of sovereignty, I quite agree about the fundamental tension that was identified. However, I do not think that is a problem in the approach that we have sketched. I believe that tension is a tension inscribed already in the international order that we have. Yes, protection of national sovereignty, respect for national sovereignty, and commitment to fundamental rights are in tension because local nationalisms can invade rights. But that is a tension that we've seen since 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, and we will continue to see it. This, once again, is where diplomacy comes in. I quite agree that the United States must work with the local nationalisms within the Indo-Pacific. But here maybe is a way to ease the tension. Respect for human rights is not the same as promoting democracy, at least to the American ear, and I think to other ears. I know to the ear in the Middle East, promoting democracy means regime change. Standing with those who stand for freedom is a bit different. You can promote freedom gradually incrementally. You can promote freedom with speeches, by sitting with dissidents, by telling their stories, by targeted sanctions where when we're speaking of really gross human rights abuses. And I remind everybody what everybody knows. Respect from national sovereignty is not just a matter of realpolitik. It also comes out of a respect for individual rights and the rights of different people to determine their own way. One respects peoples, individuals, and the groups they form by respecting what's distinctive to their traditions, their ways of governing. So the short answer is I have no way to overcome this tension, but awareness of the tension is absolutely proper. We must continually remind ourselves of it. And what we need is wise and responsible diplomacy to help us both respect national sovereignty and respect the rights which actually justify, it seems to me, national sovereignty. Burden sharing. We in the policy planning staff have been arguing that the United States should think not merely in terms of burden sharing, but in terms of the sharing of responsibilities. Working together involves more than paying up one's fair share for defense, although paying up one's fair share for defense is important. Therefore, I agree entirely with Paul that it has been the approach of this administration, and I trust the approach of the coming administration to welcome Indian leadership in the region and elsewhere, especially given our shared interests and our shared commitments to a free, open international order. Multilateral cooperation, very important issue. In the United States, at least in the Trump administration, we don't view exiting the United Nations Human Rights Council as a repudiation of multilateralism. We regard the UNHRC as a failed multilateral organization, continued participation in which would only lend legitimacy to an organization that had long ago lost its. What I want to underscore here, though, is that still represents a debate within the family, not a repudiation of international organizations, but a dispute over whether this particular one can be reclaimed and reformed. I do agree, though, with the general proposition that the great struggle of our time, the struggle against the Chinese Communist Party and its rule in China and its international depredations will require strong alliances and will require working effectively within international organizations. And therefore, I look forward to continued conversations between the United States, India, other friends and partners on how we can make international organizations work for us. Finally, economic engagement. I repeat what I've said before. Commerce and trade with China is inevitable. Our policies should be based upon at least two basic principles. One is targeted decoupling. Targeted decoupling in the most important areas, especially medical supplies, especially semiconductors, other components of the high-tech economy. The United States, along with friends and partners, must greatly reduce our reliance on the Chinese Communist Party. Second, we must join together, we must develop the proper standards so that commerce and trade with China, as with all other countries, takes place on the basis of norms of fairness and reciprocity. And here's, I guess, a third point. It is not enough for the United States to preach to countries around the world that deals with the Chinese Communist Party are bad deals. True that may be. We must continue to preach it. We must also, though, offer to countries around the world better deals. The Trump administration has begun the reform of our own international lending institutions in order to more effectively channel capital to countries around the world. We've had a focus so far on the Indo-Pacific region so that we can credibly say to a variety of countries, not only are the China deals actually designed to diminish your sovereignty, to corrupt your elites, but here's a deal. Here's investment money for the building of bridges, roads, airports, seaports, energy infrastructure, digital infrastructure. Here is investment money that is designed not to make you a dependent, but to enable you to maintain yourself as a free sovereign nation. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Peter, I know we have run out, over time. But if you have 5 minutes, can we take another round of questions? We have a few questions that.
For sure, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. There are a few questions here which are somewhat more specific. Because you had talked about in the paper talks about the sources of Chinese conduct. And the question is about, a lot of the Chinese version is about the century of humiliation and how there shouldn't be a repeat of that. So how do we ensure this balance whereby if one gets too aggressive, then also you face a blowback from the Chinese side, and that also in a way strengthens the nationalist sentiment in China. Is there a good balance to be achieved in some way in diplomacy, both for the US and other like-minded countries like India that are pushing back at the Chinese rise and Chinese aggressive nationalism? The other question is more about multilateralism, which you have addressed, but it is about, India will be part of the UN Security Council as a non-permanent member from January 2021. If you are looking, and Indo-US engagement on multilateral forums have not always been convergent. There have been tensions in the past. As we look forward, are there areas of convergence that you look at, perhaps where India and the US can work on? Of course, there is climate change, but other areas which you would like to think can become the building blocks of this engagement, at the multilateral level. And finally, I have two questions which are more about sort of meta trends. One is this. There is always this question that smaller countries or countries on the periphery ask when two major powers engage with each other, because there is always this possibility that major powers will find a modus vivendi with each other, and much like during the Cold War also it happened, and there's a possibility it might happen again. Americans and the Chinese working out a deal amongst themselves and leaving the rest to fend for themselves. And I think this is a question that permeates the minds of not policymakers, not only in India, but also in the larger Indo-Pacific. We have seen some version of it at one point in time when Mr. Obama came to office. The whole idea of G2 was very, it was on board. It didn't work out. It didn't materialize. But I think that left a mark on the thinking of policy elites in India in some ways. So can you address that question of what happens? Is there a possibility of that kind of an engagement? We have had some engagement when we have talked about, as I think Raja was pointing out, that cooperation in some areas. What does it mean? What with China? What would that look like? So this cooperation versus competition dynamic. How will the smaller states in the region or other powers in the region that are looking for American leadership, how should they assess this transition? And finally, the question on this whole shift in American domestic politics. And now this is a very difficult question, perhaps in some ways, to answer. And but there is a sense that we have seen a change in American domestic politics, which is more and more about America first, which is fine. But the implications for American policymakers are also very clear. And in some ways, Mr. Trump has led that narrative. And for the incumbent, for the new administration, it would be given that sort of political landscape that America, that we have witnessed during the elections. The consequences are quite clear. So will that domestic sentiment support the kind of engagements that perhaps this policy paper is articulating? because this paper, if you read the recommendations, a very robust global presence, a robust presence with allies, a robust engagement at the multilateral platforms. But is there enough political cachet within the country to support that kind of a global posture? Because a lot of the reading outside and in India, in certain areas, is that there is a withdrawal phase there in that you can sense, and perhaps that might lead to some other sets of consequences for American foreign policy, and therefore for countries like India and other partners in the region. So if you can respond, to some of these questions, that would be very wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have asked me a conference worth of questions, and I will try to answer them in about 5 minutes, briefly. Excellent questions. Yes, we know that China's century of humiliation from the middle of the 19th century, the Opium Wars, to the middle of the 20th century, the creation of the People's Republic of China. We know this had a huge impact on the Chinese Communist Party, how it views China and the world. And for sure, American foreign policy ought to avoid certainly gratuitous humiliation. That's why it's very important, for example, as our paper does, and as Secretary Pompeo has tirelessly emphasized, that we distinguish between the Chinese Communist Party, the party that rules, and the 1.4 billion people, or let's say 1.3 billion people, over whom the Chinese Communist Party rules in a dictatorial fashion. First and foremost, we must continue to emphasize that our quarrel is not with the Chinese people, but it is with the Chinese Communist Party for reasons that we've elaborated. And I should add, of course, that American diplomacy has to be constantly aware of this danger, though recognizing that taking a hard line is not the same thing as inflicting humiliation. On the question of multilateralism, working in the United Nations, of course, it will be impossible to specify policies that the next administration will adopt. But I want to emphasize that the Trump administration, notwithstanding occasional presidential rhetoric, but the Trump administration in general, and the Pompeo State Department in particular, has not abandoned multilateralism. To the contrary, we've spent considerable efforts, for example, working within international organizations, especially WIPO, to avoid leadership by the Chinese Communist Party. We see multilateralism as broader than simply international organizations and the United Nations. Multilateralism is not the UN first. For us, multilateralism is many-sided diplomacy, which includes, for example, a reinvigorated Quad. So again, as Paul said earlier, and I've emphasized it as well, because of our recognition of a community of interests tying together the United States and India, we expect, we hope and expect and will work for even greater cooperation in the years to come. Megatrends. Yes, we hear in the United States from a variety of friends and partners, not merely that the fear of a kind of separate peace or a separate deal that the United States and China might strike, but we also hear anxieties and requests. Please don't sandwich us, other countries say, between you and China and your great power struggle. We don't want anything of it. We'd like to cooperate with the United States, and we'd like to cooperate with China. Not what you're saying, but that's but it's a related concern we hear. Our response to both is that the United States at this particular moment is inviting friends, partners, allies to join with us in a generational struggle for a free and open international order. We don't see this as taking sides, and I don't see any way that the United States could achieve what needs to be its goal, preservation of the free and open international order, by striking a separate deal with the Chinese Communist Party. It won't achieve our goal. The U.S. interest is too deeply bound up with an international order that allows for the free flow of goods, of services, of individuals. The American commitment to individual freedom and human equality is too strong. I do not envisage the striking of a separate deal, which doesn't mean that America's cooperation with friends, partners, and allies happens automatically. As we know, there's an essential role for energetic diplomacy, and I see that continuing. American domestic politics, as I said at the beginning, 2019, and as Kennan saw in the late 1940s, this is underestimated. Thank God for and American ingenuity and dedication for building the world's most powerful military. Thank God for America's economy. But without civic concord at home, I'm speaking now of the United States, Kennan wrote this back in the 1940s, we can reaffirm it. Without the United States measuring up to what's best in our traditions, we will have the most difficult time in this great struggle for freedom. In no small measure, because we will prompt doubts in our friends and allies and partners. So I agree with you that a great deal depends upon the United States getting its own house in order, and certainly Paul and our team will continue to work to promote that. One small point on America First. In a way, this has become a very controversial slogan of the Trump administration, but in a way, it's a truism also of geopolitics, that nations inevitably put their interests first. But certainly the United States State Department under Secretary Pompeo has recognized that America has the keenest national interest in cooperating with friends and partners and allies. I can tell you that Secretary Pompeo is very proud that the very bilateral relationship with India is as strong as it's ever been. He is very pleased at the progress that has been made in revitalizing the Quad. And he has been entirely committed to, as you know, traveling the world, discussing the China challenge with friends, allies, and partners. I should make one final point. If there were time, Paul could certainly elaborate very effectively, that just as in the Cold War, the United States understood that the supreme goal was preserving freedom, and therefore it would be necessary to work not only with liberal democracies, but also with semi-authoritarian and authoritarian regimes. Remember the 1950s, Greece, Turkey, Portugal, Spain. The United States worked with these imperfect and non-democracies. Why? Because it constantly kept in mind the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal for the United States has been, must remain the preservation of a free and open international order. And for that mission, for that task, we see India as an indispensable partner. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peter. Paul, you want to say something? Since Peter mentioned your name, so I thought I would give you the last word.
No, not at all. I'll register my agreement with Peter's comments, and on the last point, I think it's an important point to emphasize that there's not sort of a purity test in terms of working together with other states. There's a spectrum, and our overriding interest is, I think, as I said, and as Peter mentioned, repeatedly, to ensure a free and open region, right? And that's our overriding goal. So different partners will have different particular interests. They'll have different types of government. And within a pretty broad range, I think, we would work with all of them to ensure that we achieve our overriding goal. So, and this is a principle that went back, as Peter said, to the Cold War, and the fact that the overriding principle and end of achieving victory, and that was really what drove us, and so we were willing to work with a wide variety of states to achieve that. So. That's I would associate myself with that point. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and we have overshot the time by a considerable margin, and I'm so thankful that you all decided to stay put. So thank you, Peter, thank you, Paul, and Raja and Indrani for this wonderful conversation, and I'm sure this conversation will continue because the China challenge is not going anywhere, and India and America will have to continue to respond to this challenge in the coming years as well. So thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.